He finally realized why nothing ever worked the moment he stopped blaming the world and started examining himself. For years, he thought his failures were the result of bad luck, difficult circumstances, or other people's unwillingness to give him a fair chance. He thought maybe he just hadn't found the right opportunity yet, or that if life would finally break his way, everything would change. But nothing did. Every new start felt promising for a moment, only to fizzle into the same familiar frustration. And then one day, sitting in the quiet, he saw it with sudden and painful clarity. The common denominator in every failure, every false start, every plan that didn't work, was him. Not because he was doomed, not because he lacked ability, but because he had been living with a set of thoughts, habits, and beliefs that sabotaged every effort before it could bear fruit. In that moment, the truth was undeniable. Until he changed himself, nothing else would change. The first thing he saw was that he had been chasing outcomes without ever building the foundation for them. He wanted success without discipline, opportunity without preparation, reward without service. He mistook excitement for readiness. He believed that wanting something badly enough was the same as being ready to handle it. But life doesn't work that way. Life gives us not what we want, but what we are prepared to receive and sustain. He saw that every time he had gotten close to a breakthrough, his lack of structure, his lack of consistent habits had quietly pulled him back to where he started. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized this was not unique to him. It was the story of countless people who want change without building the identity that can hold it. He finally understood that the soil must be ready before the seed can take root, and he had been scattering seeds on rocky ground. The next realization was harder to face. He had been living reactively, letting circumstances set the tone for his days, instead of deciding in advance who he would be and how he would operate. If things went well in the morning, his mood lifted and his actions followed. If something went wrong, he allowed it to derail his focus for hours, sometimes days. This meant his progress was never steady. It rose and fell on the waves of external events. He saw now that nothing lasting could be built on such unstable ground. The men and women he admired did not live this way. They decided their direction in advance. They anchored themselves in purpose, and they moved through both calm and storm with the same steady pace. He realized that until he took control of his own mind, his results would always belong to the mercy of the day's weather. He also began to see the role of his environment. For years, he surrounded himself with people who talked more than they acted, who saw the downside of every idea, who lived in constant complaint. It wasn't that they were bad people, it was that their way of thinking had become the air he breathed. Slowly, without even noticing, he had adopted their patterns. Their doubts became his doubts, their limitations became his. And because he never challenged it, he thought this was just the way life was. But now he could see how much of his thinking wasn't even his own. If he wanted different results, he would need to live in a different climate, a climate of action, of possibility, of accountability. This didn't mean abandoning people, but it did mean taking responsibility for the mental company he kept. Perhaps the most sobering truth was that he had been lying to himself about his own effort. He liked to think he was working hard, but when he looked closely, he saw how often he had chosen the easier path, how often he had avoided the uncomfortable work in favor of what felt good in the moment. He remembered all the times he said, "I'll start tomorrow," or "I've done enough for today," when deep down he knew he could have done more. And in that honest moment, he saw that the results he had were the exact results he had earned. Not more, not less. Life had been perfectly fair in that regard. This was painful, but it was also freeing, because if his results were caused by his own actions, then by changing those actions, he could change everything. Another thing that came into focus was his misunderstanding of failure. For years, he had treated every setback as proof that he wasn't meant to succeed, as a signal to stop. But now he understood that failure was never the end. It was feedback. It was information. It was life's way of saying, "Not yet, try again, adjust this, learn that." The people he admired had not avoided failure. They had used it. They treated it as a stepping stone, not a wall. He realized that if he could stop fearing failure, he could start extracting the lessons that would eventually make success inevitable. And in that realization, fear began to lose its hold. He also confronted the fact that he had been too concerned with how things looked, and not concerned enough with how things actually were. He wanted to be seen as someone making progress, so he spent energy on appearances, talking about plans, sharing his goals, celebrating before the work was finished. But those displays were empty, without the depth of consistent execution behind them. They gave a temporary feeling of accomplishment, but they didn't move him closer to the life he wanted. He saw now that real progress is often invisible at first, that it happens quietly, away from applause. The applause comes later, and it comes naturally, when the results are undeniable. The final truth of that moment was both simple and profound. He had been trying to change his results without changing himself. He had been chasing new circumstances while carrying the same mindset into every opportunity. And because of that, every new chapter ended the same way as the last. It was never the job, the business, the plan, or the people. It was always the person he brought into it. And now he understood that the key to everything was to become the kind of person for whom success was the natural outcome, not a lucky break. A person whose habits, standards, focus, and discipline made good results inevitable. And from that point forward, he committed to stop asking, when will things change for me? And start asking, when will I change for them? It was the first real turning point of his life. When he woke the next morning after that realization, something felt different, not in the world, but in him. The problems were still there, the responsibilities unchanged, but there was a new clarity in how he saw them. For the first time, he wasn't looking for a quick escape or a miracle fix. He understood that nothing had ever worked because he had never truly worked on the root of the issue himself. That morning, instead of reaching for distractions, he sat still and thought about the person he would need to become to earn the life he wanted. It wasn't a vague image anymore. He could see the standards, the habits, the decisions, the level of focus required. And that clarity brought a quiet determination he had never felt before, because it shifted his attention from chasing outcomes to building the character that could create them. One of the first changes he made was to stop leaving his days to chance. Before, he would wake up and simply react to whatever demanded his attention: messages, calls, problems, other people's priorities. This had made him feel busy but not productive. Now he started setting his direction before the day began. He identified the most important work, the actions that would truly move him forward, and committed to doing them no matter how he felt. At first, this discipline felt foreign. He had been so accustomed to letting mood and circumstance dictate his pace that pushing through resistance was uncomfortable. But he reminded himself that comfort had been his downfall, and each time he acted in spite of resistance, the muscle of discipline grew stronger. He also began to guard his environment with a seriousness he'd never considered before. He realized how much the voices around him shaped the voice within him. The constant negativity, the subtle doubts, the small-minded jokes about big dreams, they had all been planting seeds in his mind, and he had been letting them grow unchecked. Now he became deliberate about who he spent time with and what conversations he entertained. This didn't mean abandoning people altogether, but it did mean choosing proximity to those who were builders, doers, and thinkers rather than complainers and cynics. He filled more of his time with books, lectures, and ideas that fed his vision instead of draining it, and slowly the inner dialogue began to change. Perhaps the most challenging shift was confronting his own excuses. He had told himself countless stories over the years about why something wasn't possible. Stories that sounded convincing in the moment, but were in truth designed to protect him from effort and risk. He realized these weren't harmless thoughts. They were the very chains holding him back, so he started questioning them. Every time an excuse appeared, he asked, "Is this true? Or is this just the comfortable lie I've been telling myself?" Most of the time it was the latter, and each time he exposed one, it lost some of its power. Over time, the space once filled with justifications became space for solutions. He also redefined his relationship with work. In the past, he had treated work as something to get through so he could reach the reward. Now he began to see the work itself as the reward, the daily process as the place where he was shaping himself into the person he wanted to be. This shift made him less impatient for results. He understood that the habits he practiced each day were not just moving him toward his goals, they were transforming him into the kind of person for whom those goals would be natural. And this understanding kept him steady, even when the progress was invisible, because he knew he was building the foundation beneath the surface. Another important change came in how he responded to setbacks. Before, any obstacle would cause him to slow down, question himself, or even abandon the effort entirely. Now he treated setbacks as tests. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" he asked, "What is this here to teach me?" He began to notice that each challenge revealed a weakness in his preparation or a gap in his skill. And rather than avoiding those weaknesses, he addressed them directly. Over time, what had once stopped him began to strengthen him. Problems that would have derailed him in the past became routine challenges he could handle without panic. He also stopped trying to impress others with his intentions and started letting his actions speak. In the past, he would talk at length about what he was going to do, enjoying the small hit of approval that came with sharing big plans. But he realized that talking about the work gave him the illusion of progress while delaying the actual doing. Now he kept most of his intentions private and focused on execution. When others asked what he was working on, he simply said, "You'll see." This not only protected his energy but also gave him the satisfaction of revealing results instead of promises. The biggest breakthrough, however, was understanding that all real change begins internally. For years he had chased external changes, new jobs, new locations, new ventures, hoping they would transform his life. But without changing the mindset, the standards and the habits that guided him, each new opportunity had eventually collapsed into the same old results. Now he understood that internal transformation was not optional, it was the foundation. And every day he acted in alignment with his new identity. He felt the old patterns losing their grip. For the first time in his life, he wasn't wondering if things would work out. He knew they would, because he was finally becoming the kind of person who made them work. He began to notice patterns in his old life that he had once been blind to. It was like walking into a room with the lights suddenly turned on. Things he had accepted for years now looked obvious, even absurd. He saw how often he had started things without finishing them, moving on to the next idea the moment the first signs of boredom or difficulty appeared. This constant cycle of beginnings without completions had trained his mind to expect that nothing would last, and so it never gave its full commitment to anything. He understood now that momentum is built in the middle, not at the start, and that the ability to push through the long, quiet stretch between excitement and result is what separates the accomplished from the dreamers. He resolved that from now on, anything worth starting would be worth finishing, and that he would not scatter his focus across a dozen shallow attempts when one deep effort would yield the real reward. He also recognized how much of his life had been spent in passive observation rather than deliberate participation. He would watch others succeed, consume endless information about success, and yet fail to apply even the simplest principle with consistency. He realized he had been treating knowledge like a possession rather than a tool, collecting it, storing it, even showing it off in conversation, but rarely using it to build anything tangible. That was why nothing ever worked. He was rich in theory but poor in practice. From that day forward, he made a pact with himself that no lesson, no insight, no piece of advice would be allowed to sit idle. If he learned it in the morning, he would apply it by night. He saw clearly that the bridge between knowing and doing was where most people fell, and he refused to fall there again. Another habit he dismantled was his tendency to work only when inspiration struck. In the past, if the spark wasn't there, he would convince himself that waiting was better than forcing it. But he finally saw the flaw in that thinking. Waiting for inspiration had kept him inconsistent, and inconsistency had kept him mediocre. He realized that professionals don't rely on moods to produce. They produce because they've built the discipline to show up whether they feel like it or not. He began to treat his work like a commitment instead of a suggestion, and in doing so he discovered something unexpected. Showing up created its own inspiration. The act of beginning generated the energy to continue. This single change dissolved one of the biggest excuses that had quietly ruled his life. He started looking closely at the way he made decisions. For years he had relied on impulse and emotion, often choosing what felt good in the moment rather than what was aligned with his long-term vision. This reactive approach had left him with a trail of short-lived victories and long-term setbacks. Now he began to ask himself a simple but powerful question before making a choice. Will this matter in 5 years? That question stripped away much of the noise and revealed the truth about his priorities. Decisions that once felt urgent lost their pull, while choices that once seemed small took on new importance. It became clear to him that his past had been shaped less by the big moments than by the small, repeated choices he had underestimated. He also confronted the way he had been using his time. In the past, he would fill his days with activity and mistake it for progress. He kept busy enough to avoid guilt, but much of that busyness was nothing more than disguised avoidance, tasks that looked productive but had no real impact on his future. He saw that his schedule had been built around comfort, not growth. From then on, he began designing his days around a few high-value actions, the ones that would compound over time into real change. At first, this meant saying no to things that had long been part of his routine, but with each no, he gained back hours of focus, and with that focus came results that had once seemed impossible. One of the most surprising discoveries was how often he had let fear dress itself up as logic. He had told himself he was being cautious, weighing his options, avoiding unnecessary risk, when in truth he was simply avoiding discomfort. He saw that his careful thinking was often just overthinking, and that overthinking had cost him countless opportunities. He began to replace hesitation with calculated action, making decisions faster and learning through doing instead of waiting for certainty that would never come. And in doing so, he felt a new kind of momentum take hold, one that came not from perfect planning, but from consistent movement. He also addressed the way he spoke to himself. In the past, his inner dialogue had been a constant stream of criticism, doubt, and second-guessing. He had believed this was simply being realistic, but he realized it was a form of sabotage. Every negative phrase he repeated to himself was reinforcing an identity that couldn't succeed. He decided that his self-talk would reflect the person he was becoming, not the person he had been. This didn't mean lying to himself. It meant speaking with the same belief and encouragement he would give to someone he was mentoring. Over time, this shift in language began to shift his identity, and with it his actions. Perhaps the most important change in this stage of his transformation was that he stopped expecting quick, dramatic results. He accepted that building the life he wanted was not a single leap but a series of steps, each one taken with intention and consistency. And while there would be moments of breakthrough, most of the progress would be steady and quiet. He no longer chased the rush of instant gratification, because he finally understood the value of patience paired with relentless action. For the first time, nothing felt rushed, and yet everything was moving forward. Word count 1026. He realized that if his life was going to change at the level of outcomes, it had to change first at the level of standards. Goals were not enough. He had set goals before and then negotiated with them when the day became inconvenient. Standards, on the other hand, were non-negotiable lines, simple, measurable, and lived. He wrote them down like laws: how he would start his mornings, how he would plan his days, how he would treat his body, how he would speak to others and to himself, how he would finish what he began. Nothing dramatic, just clear thresholds beneath which he would not allow himself to fall. At first they felt strict, even severe, but soon he noticed something new: peace. The noise that came from constant internal bargaining began to quiet. Decisions were easier because they were already made. He then built systems to protect those standards from the unpredictable weather of life. He had always believed discipline was a matter of willpower, and when willpower faded, his results did too. Now he saw discipline as architecture. He prepared his workspace the night before so the morning required no ramp-up. He blocked the first 90 minutes of every day for the single task that moved his future forward. He put his phone in another room during deep work. He created a weekly review on paper, asking the same questions each time. What worked? What didn't? What will I improve? These simple structures did not remove difficulty, but they removed friction. And when friction dropped, consistency rose. He wasn't relying on motivation anymore. He was relying on design. A powerful shift occurred in how he measured success. He had once measured by outcomes, the numbers, the recognition, the visible milestones. Those mattered, but he discovered a better early indicator: integrity with inputs. If he had kept his standards, executed his systems, and honored his top priorities for the day, he counted it a win regardless of what the scoreboard showed. This reframing did not lower the bar. It moved the bar to where he had control. Paradoxically, when he stopped obsessing over outcomes and mastered his controllables, outcomes began to improve. He was no longer yanked around by the daily rise and fall of results. He was steady, and the steadiness compounded. He looked hard at his relationship with money and service. In the past, he had chased income without clearly understanding value. Now he embraced a simple law: your rewards will always be in proportion to your contribution. He asked, what problem am I solving for whom? How deeply? How consistently? He stopped trying to be clever and started trying to be useful. He studied his craft the way a tradesman sharpens tools, patiently, daily, deliberately. He improved the quality of his work, the speed of delivery, the clarity of communication, and the reliability of follow-through. He learned to think like the person on the other end: what they feared, what they needed, what would remove friction for them. Service, not self-importance, became his strategy. Money followed value, just as harvest follows planting. He also refined the way he handled energy. He had thought of time as his main resource, but now he saw that energy governed time's usefulness. He protected sleep as fiercely as deadlines. He trained his body for stamina, not vanity. He simplified nutrition to remove decision fatigue. He built in brief resets between blocks of work, a walk, a page of notes, a moment of stillness, so his mind returned to the desk sharp rather than dulled. He noticed the difference between activities that looked productive and those that actually produced. Meetings shortened, screens dimmed, silence increased. With fewer leaks, his energy rose, and with higher energy, the same hour accomplished twice as much with half the strain. Humility became a lever. He stopped needing to be right and started needing to learn. When feedback came, he listened without defense, harvesting the useful and discarding the rest. He sought mentors, sometimes in books, sometimes in people, and asked better questions. What do you see that I don't? Where is the real constraint? If I had to double my output with the same hours, what would I change first? He discovered that breakthroughs often hid behind a single unasked question. Pride had kept those doors closed, humility opened them, and with each improvement he returned to the field quickly, testing the new insight in action rather than admiring it on paper. Gratitude, once a sentiment, became a strategy. He had previously used it sporadically, something to consider when things went well. Now he practiced it especially when things were difficult. Each night he recorded 3 concrete gains and 1 lesson. The practice did not blind him to problems, it balanced his perception. It kept his attention from collapsing into what was missing and trained it to notice what was working. Gratitude widened his mental horizon, and a wider horizon made better solutions visible. He found himself less anxious, more resourceful, and quicker to act. The day did not feel lighter because the world changed. It felt lighter because his mind did. Finally, he aligned identity with behavior so there was no gap left to trip him. He stopped saying, "I'm trying to be disciplined," and began saying, "I am the man who does what he says." He stopped saying, "I hope this works," and replaced it with, "I build systems that work when I work them." Identity is a compass, behavior is the step. With both pointed in the same direction, he no longer wasted energy fighting himself. He wasn't chasing a new self as if it lived somewhere far away. He was inhabiting it now, one standard, one system, one decision at a time. And as that alignment took root, he understood with quiet certainty why nothing had ever worked before and why now everything could. He began to realize that one of the most corrosive forces in his old life had been the habit of letting small losses turn into full retreats. In the past, if he missed a workout, he might abandon the whole week. If he slipped on his diet once, he would give himself permission to spiral for days. If he broke a productive streak, he would tell himself it was ruined, so why bother? These patterns turned minor setbacks into major detours, and they taught his mind that failure was final. Now he built a new rule: never miss twice. If he broke a habit one day, he returned to it the next without negotiation. This single principle rewired his relationship with mistakes. They were no longer the end of progress, but brief pauses in a journey that always resumed. And over time, these quick recoveries compounded into an unshakable resilience. Another revelation came when he examined the invisible weight of unfinished conversations. There were people he needed to forgive, boundaries he needed to set, and truths he had been avoiding saying aloud. These loose ends consumed more energy than he'd realized. Every time his mind wandered to them, it left him distracted, unsettled, and hesitant. So he began addressing them directly. Sometimes that meant speaking plainly. Other times it meant writing a letter he would never send, simply to put the emotions into words and out of his mind. He discovered that clarity in relationships, whether through reconciliation or release, created the same feeling as clearing a cluttered room. Suddenly there was space to move freely. He also confronted his tendency to overcomplicate solutions. In the past, he'd bury himself in research, explore countless options, and delay action under the guise of being thorough. But this endless refinement was just another way of avoiding the discomfort of execution. Now his focus was on simplicity. For every challenge, he asked, "What is the next simplest step I can take that moves this forward?" Then he did that step immediately. The more he practiced this, the more he saw that complexity rarely created better results. It just created more room for hesitation. Simple, clear actions, repeated often, began producing results faster than all his previous elaborate plans combined. A major shift also occurred in how he handled feedback. He used to filter every piece of criticism through his ego, taking offense even when the intent was to help. This defensiveness had cost him valuable insights, as he was more concerned with protecting his pride than improving his performance. Now he adopted a different mindset. Every piece of feedback was a data point, not a judgment of his worth. If it was useful, he applied it. If it wasn't, he set it aside without resentment. This emotional detachment allowed him to extract value from sources he once would have dismissed and to grow in areas he hadn't even realized were weak. He restructured his relationship with time itself. Before, his days were a blur of reacting to whatever appeared urgent, leaving little energy for what was truly important. Urgent tasks shouted, important tasks whispered. He began planning his days with a new sequence. First, the meaningful work that aligned with his long-term vision, then everything else. This reordering created a sense of accomplishment early in the day that carried into everything else. The evenings felt lighter, not because there was less to do, but because the essential work was already done. It taught him that the real weight of a day comes from what you leave undone, not from what you complete. He also dismantled the illusion that motivation was a prerequisite for action. He had wasted years waiting for the right mood before taking the first step. never realizing that action often creates the very motivation he thought he needed beforehand. Now his rule was to begin, even if the start was imperfect. Momentum, he learned, doesn't require inspiration, it requires movement. And once he was in motion, the feelings he thought he had to wait for usually arrived as a result, not as a cause. Perhaps the most liberating change was removing the mental clutter of living in two timelines at once. Before, half of his thoughts were in the past, replaying mistakes and regrets, while the other half were in the future, worrying about problems that hadn't yet occurred. This constant split meant he was rarely present in the only moment he could actually influence the current one. Now he practiced bringing his attention back to where his hands were, to the single task in front of him. The more he did this, the more progress he made, not because he was doing more, but because he was doing it fully. Presence became his greatest amplifier. By weaving these changes into his daily life, he noticed that progress no longer felt fragile. In the past, one bad day could undo his momentum. Now his momentum was self-repairing. Mistakes were addressed, conversations were clarified, decisions were simplified, feedback was welcomed, priorities were protected, action was constant, and his focus was anchored to the present. He could see clearly now why nothing had worked before and why, with these shifts in place, it would be far harder for anything to fail. He began to see that one of the most dangerous habits in his old life had been tolerating low standards in small areas, telling himself they didn't matter. A messy desk, a half-finished task, an unanswered message, a late arrival. None of these seemed catastrophic in isolation, but together they formed an unspoken pattern. Close enough was good enough. This quiet lowering of the bar seeped into everything he did, and without realizing it, he had been training himself to accept less than his best. Now he raised the floor beneath him. The smallest commitments mattered. If he said he'd be somewhere at 9, he arrived early. If he used something, he put it back in order. If he opened a document, he finished what he started. These little acts repeated daily rewired his sense of identity. He was no longer the man who almost did things. He was the man who completed them. He also addressed the mental clutter of scattered goals. In the past, he would set multiple ambitions at once, start a new business, change his health habits, learn a skill, reorganize his finances, and then try to make progress on all of them simultaneously. It left him stretched thin, chasing everything and catching nothing. Now he applied ruthless focus. He picked the single goal that would create the most positive ripple effect in his life and gave it the majority of his energy until it was no longer fragile. This focus felt slower at first, but soon the results spoke for themselves. Progress in one major area made it easier to succeed in the next, and the compound effect began working in his favor. Another shift was his relationship with uncertainty. Previously, he had treated uncertainty as a red light, a reason to wait until more was known. But he now understood that certainty is a luxury of hindsight, and that the people who succeed are the ones who move when the picture is still incomplete. He stopped waiting for every answer and started moving with what he had, adjusting along the way. This approach demanded humility because it meant being willing to be wrong and quick to change course. But it also created momentum where before there had been paralysis. He discovered that forward motion itself often revealed the answers he thought he had to wait for. He examined how much mental energy he had wasted on trying to control things beyond his reach, other people's opinions, the timing of opportunities, the behavior of competitors. These had occupied too much of his attention. Now he made a clear division: what is mine to control and what is not. The first category became his sole focus. The second category was acknowledged, but left alone. This discipline freed an enormous amount of energy that he redirected into actions that moved the needle in his life. It also gave him a steadier emotional state because he was no longer reacting to every shift in the external world. One of the more subtle changes was how he used his downtime. In the past, idle moments were quickly filled with distraction, scrolling, noise, or shallow entertainment. These gave him temporary relief but left him feeling dulled and unfocused. Now he treated downtime as an investment. Sometimes he used it to read, to review his goals, to learn, or to rest deeply without stimulation. Other times he simply let his mind be still, allowing ideas and solutions to surface that never appeared when his attention was constantly hijacked. This shift made him sharper during work and more at peace during rest. He also began confronting the cost of unfinished repairs, problems he knew about but ignored. A system in his business that didn't quite work, a recurring mistake he never fixed, a personal habit he kept excusing. These small, unresolved issues drained him because they remained open loops in his mind. Now he made a practice of closing loops quickly. If something was broken, he fixed it. If a process was flawed, he improved it. The relief of solving these small problems was immediate, and the accumulation of solved problems created a cleaner, lighter mental environment. Perhaps the deepest change was in how he viewed himself in relation to his future. In the past, he had seen his future self as a distant stranger, someone he would become one day if things went right. That distance made it easy to neglect the small choices of today. Now he saw his future self as the direct product of his present self, connected by every action, every thought, every standard. When he made a decision, he asked, "Will the man I am becoming thank me for this, or will he have to clean up after me?" This simple question reshaped his behavior in ways no external pressure ever could. By clearing the mental clutter of low standards, scattered focus, fear of uncertainty, misplaced control, wasted downtime, and unfinished repairs, he created a life that no longer depended on hope to work. He wasn't leaving progress to chance. He was designing it, and with each deliberate act, the gap between who he was and who he intended to be grew smaller, until the two were nearly the same. He knew now that the final layer of change would not come from adding more goals, rules, or habits. It would come from protecting what he had built. In his old life, he had treated progress as something fragile, easily lost if life became chaotic. That belief had made him cling to results rather than to the process that produced them. Now he understood that his real security came from the systems, standards, and identity he had installed. As long as those remained intact, he could rebuild from any setback. This realization freed him from the anxiety of losing ground. He no longer chased the feeling of progress, he carried the certainty of it, knowing it was a natural byproduct of how he now lived each day. This was a shift from hoping to trusting, from desperation to quiet confidence. He had finally learned that real success is not something you hold, it's something you embody. One of the biggest threats to that certainty had always been distraction disguised as opportunity. In the past, any new venture, idea, or invitation that seemed exciting could pull him off course, scattering his energy across unrelated pursuits. Each detour slowed the momentum of what truly mattered. He remembered how easy it was to rationalize, telling himself that it was networking or diversification, when in reality it was just avoidance of deep work. Now he had a filter. Does this align with my mission? Does it strengthen the main work I am building, or does it dilute it? If the answer was unclear, the answer was no. This single discipline kept his focus sharp and his mental space uncluttered, ensuring that his attention flowed toward depth rather than breadth. Every yes was now a conscious investment, every no a way of protecting the architecture of his future. He also replaced the false urgency of constant busyness with the deliberate pacing of a builder. Before, he had equated speed with progress, filling his calendar to prove he was working hard, but speed without strategy had led to burnout and shallow results. Now he valued sustained effort over frantic motion. He worked in defined blocks, each one tied directly to his highest priorities, and he refused to measure his worth by how exhausted he felt at the end of the day. This approach not only improved his performance, it preserved the energy he needed for consistent execution over months and years, instead of short bursts followed by collapse. He learned that true productivity is measured not in hours worked, but in meaningful outcomes produced. A major breakthrough came in how he handled recognition, or the lack of it. There had been times when he gave his best effort, saw real results, and yet received no applause, no acknowledgement. In his old mindset, this absence of validation drained his motivation. Now he was unmoved by it. He had learned to treat recognition as a pleasant bonus, not as the reason for the work. The reward was in the integrity of doing what he said he would do, in the satisfaction of building something real, and in the quiet knowledge that results always speak louder than opinions. This detachment gave him the freedom to work invisibly for as long as necessary, knowing the right people would notice when the time was right. The lack of attention no longer felt like neglect, it felt like an advantage, giving him space to work without interference. He also learned to protect his mental clarity by refusing to indulge in unnecessary conflict. In the past, he had been drawn into arguments to prove a point or to defend his choices, wasting hours and emotional energy on people who had no real stake in his life. Now he recognized that most debates were not about truth but about ego. He no longer needed to win those battles. He walked away not from weakness but from understanding that the cost of engagement was greater than the benefit. His focus was on building, not convincing, and the more he walked away, the more time and clarity he gained. This discipline of disengagement became as important to his progress as the habits he kept, because it kept his attention where it could make the most impact. Perhaps the most profound change was in how he approached his own limitations. Before, he saw them as flaws to hide or deny, as proof that he might not be capable of what he wanted. Now he saw them as tools for growth. Every limitation was a teacher. pointing directly to the skills, disciplines, or mindsets he needed to develop. Instead of avoiding these areas, he moved toward them, knowing that every improvement made him harder to stop. This shift transformed challenge from something he dreaded into something he actively sought. A gap in his knowledge became an opportunity to learn. A weakness in execution became a chance to innovate. Obstacles stopped being dead ends and became blueprints for his next step. He developed the habit of regular recalibration. Once a week, he reviewed his actions, his progress, and his alignment with his long-term vision. This review was not a place for self-criticism, but for adjustment. He treated it like steering a ship, small course corrections made early to avoid major detours later. This practice kept him from drifting and ensured that his actions stayed rooted in his highest priorities. Over time, this habit became a form of quiet leadership over himself, one that replaced guesswork with deliberate control. Another safeguard he built was the art of ending well. In the past, he would let projects or commitments fade away when interest or momentum ran out, leaving loose ends and lingering doubts. Now he either finished them fully or ended them with intention. This closure prevented mental clutter and freed resources for the next focus. It also reinforced the identity he had built, the man who follows through, whether by completion or by clean, conscious release. And so, with each passing day, the man who had once wondered why nothing ever worked now carried himself with the calm assurance of someone who knew exactly why it did. His results were no longer lucky or fragile. They were the predictable harvest of seeds planted in thought, cultivated in habit, and protected in focus. He no longer chased breakthroughs, he created them. And because his foundation was no longer built on hope or circumstance, but on choice and character, he knew that the work of his life would endure long after the noise of the moment had faded. He was no longer building for approval or even for recognition. He was building because this is who he had become, and that was the truest and most lasting victory.